Hello and welcome to part 2 of the How-To series on cross-border payments. In this particular segment, we'll be exploring how to reduce risk in your cross-border payments process. I'm your host, Andy O'Gara, and anyone who joined part 1 of the webinar series on how to make cross-border payments easier and more cost-effective will know that we're trying to really have a focused session. So we'll be trying to keep this between 15 and 20 minutes in duration. I'm delighted to be joined by a team of expert panelists today. First up, I have Denise Rudich. Denise is a well-known financial crime prevention specialist with extensive knowledge and experience in anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, sanctions, bribery and corruption, modern slavery, and tax evasion. Hi, Denise, and welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Also joining Denise today is Simon McFeely. Simon is responsible for overseeing the day-to-day compliance operations of TransferMate. Simon has over 12 years experience operating in risk-focused roles and previously served as the Global Head of Compliance Risk Assessment at Western Union. Hi, Simon, and welcome.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay. So I said, a real focused session today, so we won't necessarily have time for a live Q&A. But please feel free to enter any questions along with your name in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get back to you right after this session. Okay, so why don't we look at what we're going to be learning today? So really, what we're basically going to be learning is how to spot, prevent, and guard against risks when making cross-border payments. Right, as we're going to start by looking at the types of risks facing businesses today. So Simon, I'm going to start with you here. So the first question that we have is, what are the primary sources of risks faced by businesses today when making cross-border payments?
Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to look at this from two different angles. The first is really about, how you make those payments, who your vendor is. And the second angle is going to be around fraud risk, particularly focusing on business email compromise. So taking that first angle, understanding how can risk come into my business because of the vendor that I choose. And, that can really be a real problem to your business. And the reason for that is by selecting the vendor, you may not, the correct vendor for your business, you may end up paying more fees, more banking fees, cross-border fees, account fees, etc. And then even worse, you may get a lot of headaches when payments go missing or you don't really know in what status they're in. And that can disrupt your day-to-day operations. And, a good payment experience is really one that you shouldn't have to worry about. Making a payment to a supplier, for example, isn't the core business of most businesses. They're making goods, they're selling services, and making a payment should be something that you really shouldn't have to worry about. Therefore, you run the risk of actually not having the best payment provider or solution out there for you. The second then risk we want to talk about is that fraud risk or cybercrime risk. And it's probably the biggest risk out there that everyone faces every single day, be that as an individual or be that as a business customer. You could be a small business, you could be a large multinational. The fraudsters are agnostic and they will try and infiltrate and disrupt your business. We can look at stats from the UK or for the US, and the loss to the businesses in those countries is into the billions and billions and billions. So really it's all about selecting the right vendor and then also understanding what steps as a business you can take to mitigate that potential loss of revenue or loss from your bank accounts.
Okay, thanks, Simon. So Denise, I'm going to direct this next part of this question to you. So, over the last year or so, we've seen a number of macro risks pop up, right? Examples of that, the war in Ukraine, the supply chain crisis. So what can businesses do to protect themselves against these types of threats, especially when they don't have any control over them, really?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of this could never happen moments. Like you said, the war in Ukraine, we had global quarantine, changes to the way in which people are living and working and operating and making payments, right? And grand scale technological innovation and adoption as well. So you know, on the one hand, it could be really easy to say there's nothing you can do, good luck. However, there are still ways for businesses to protect themselves, and that includes things such as horizon planning, looking to see what's coming down the line. I'm also director of the G7 G20 research group. There are summits. Every summit, leaders come out with a communique, and they also include a list of countries that they're worried about. Look at those countries, identify those countries, and identify what are the terrorist risk, the weapons of mass destruction and proliferation financing risks, laundering the proceeds of corruption risk, and also those lists and things like the Financial Action Task Force as well, the published list of countries that might be higher risk, give you an indication of where your payments might actually be paused for further review and for being looked at a little bit more closely. Look at sanctions, see what's happening in the world in terms of sanctions. Make sure that your systems are fine-tuned in place, understand your suppliers, understand the lists that they use, understand the algorithms and how, the false positive rates, to make sure that, you, in addition to partnering up with your suppliers and partnering up with your partnerships, that you are also understanding how they work and they operate, because there's also an expectation that you do know what it is that you're bringing into your organization to help you manage your risks. And the last thing I would say is make sure that you're training your employees. That means, training and awareness programs. That means if you have specific businesses that operate or that only make payments to higher risk countries on a cross-border basis, make them aware of what are some of the key risks that they could be looking at if they're specifically focusing on countries that are in emerging markets or where there is conflict and there are humanitarian payments that need to be made. So look at your people, train your people, test your systems, make sure your processes are constantly being updated, especially when there's new information that's coming out, and data. Make sure that you're using the data that's available to you and the data points that are there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks. Fantastic. So, when we start looking at, there's quite a lot that businesses have to take in, to be fair. Everything you just mentioned, Denise, and also you, Simon. But to sum it up, businesses face risks from really two main areas that they can control, which is really on the cost side, as well as, the criminal or the tax. And then there's those risks which they can't control, which they certainly can try to mitigate against. Excellent. So why don't we move on to section 2 now, and look at some real life practical examples, what business should be looking out for as it relates to risks. So Simon, I'm going to direct this first part to you. Okay.
Yeah.
And what are some of the common types of tactics used by criminals to attack businesses?
Yeah, I think picking up on Denise's last point around the horizon planning and kind of, really looking down your supply chain and the markets in which you're serving and sending payments to is absolutely critical, and something that you absolutely need to focus on and check into from time to time. You can also go one step deeper and think about, okay, put yourselves in the shoes of a criminal, put yourself in the shoe of a fraudster, and think about how can they extract money or assets from my business. And if we think about those business email compromise kind of fraud attacks that are so rampant around the world right now and are growing every day and every month, think about how sophisticated it can be, but also how simple they can be. So, if we explain what that looks like, they're a form of what you call phishing attack. And this is where the fraudster pretends to be the supplier, and they can do that in a few different ways. Usually they will try and intercept an actual real invoice that the customer is expecting from their supplier. And in some cases, we see the fraudster actually taking control of the supplier's email account, so that invoice can actually come from the real email account of the supplier. However, the fraudster is controlling the email account. And in this scheme, you may see interaction between the fraudster and the customer. And when I mean customer, that could be the procurement manager, could be the finance officer, or it could be the manager that's receiving the service. And usually it will be accompanied by a request to make a change to the beneficiary bank. So essentially, the supplier, who's the fraudster, is asking the customer, I need to change my bank details. And in some cases, they will say, if you pay us now, we'll give you a discount. Or in some cases, they will say, we've just had an audit and our auditors have said, you have our old bank details, so we have these new bank details. And going back to the point earlier on that fraud is always around us, sometimes we see that the person in a work environment is not as, I would say, curious to query those types of changes because these happen quite often. Therefore, to Denise's point, it's very important that businesses have the right policies and the procedures and the training, and they empower their staff to ask those questions like, can I please see evidence that you've changed your bank account? We'll get into that in the course of the next few slides.
Okay, great. So Denise, I'm going to direct this next part to you though and take a slightly different angle. So how can we make sure that good transactions aren't held up unnecessarily, and why would this even happen in the first place?
So again, I guess the biggest kind of way of making sure that good transactions are held up, or well, that transactions are held up, is by setting up your filters in a way that basically says, for this country, you do not make any payments. For this address, you do not make any payments. And the challenge with that is not only are you preventing payments from going to individuals who have legitimate business and a legitimate right to receive transactions, you could also be kind of causing human rights issues because, that could also affect their right to living and things like that. So in terms of making sure that good transactions aren't held up is, again, understand how your systems are set up. Make sure that if you are putting in a particular country into a filter, also try to identify additional keywords that will trigger a payment. If there are countries that have sanctions in them, there are individuals generally that are sanctioned and entities that are sanctioned. So again, if you want to include those, that's fine. That's payment filtering. But if you're particularly worried about one country, that could also affect individuals' nationalities as well, or individuals from different nationalities that might not actually even be residents in that country. And it's just making sure that kind of there isn't just one data point that is kind of leading for transactions to be, originally stopped. That said, Simon had an excellent example, which I'm not sure if he's going to be willing to share or not, that we had during our discussions. As to why sometimes it's good to hold up the transactions. The other thing is as well, making sure that if there are, again, normally payments and transactions are held up because of your payment monitoring systems, but also your sanction systems, identifying them. And it's just constantly testing, constantly configuring, constantly assessing what works, what doesn't work, testing your false positive and false alert rate. And again, reconfiguring your system so that that it isn't holding up good transactions. And if there are licenses that need to be had to allow for humanitarian payments to go through, then again, making sure that you're asking your customers for that, or making your customers aware of that, and kind of public notices on your website to let them say, if you're making payments to these countries, make sure that you have a license. And also around making sure that full information accompanies a payment, so that includes originator and ultimate beneficiary information as well.
Perfect. So great. I mean, thanks very much, guys. That was really extensive. So to summarize, we go into summary. So basically, again, there's a lot for business to take in here. So, when you look at the attacks, they basically come from anywhere. I mean, multiple angles, multiple sources, both internally and externally. And really what we need is sophisticated systems to be able to identify the threats and deal with them in a timely manner. So great. Why don't we go on to section 3? So really the first step in you being able to protect your business is knowing what attacks may come. And you guys have done an excellent job of kind of summarizing these out. So, from a philosophy standpoint, I'm going to direct this one at you, Simon. So what is the philosophy organizations should follow to reduce risk when making cross-border payments?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I would start off with the suggestion that, understand your risks. And that doesn't have to be an overly complicated process. Basically you're conducting a risk assessment. It can be gathering people from different parts of your business, looking at your business model, looking at the types of suppliers you pay, the way you set them up, the countries you're interacting with, the payment vendor you have selected, and really think about, you know, every component of the risk spectrum, from your own technology risks right up to like that your payment risk, your fraud risk, etc. Because going back to something that I said, fraudsters really don't care if you're a small business or a big international. They will just attack and attack and attack, and they'll attack through different ways. I mentioned about taking over email accounts, intercepting invoices, but also could be a little bit more technical, and they will use malware and look to bring cyber infections into your systems, and they can be occur through clicking links, etc. So it's really about conducting that risk assessment, making it your own, considering your business, and then think about those controls. And Denise touched on it as well: your policies, your procedures, the testing you do around it, the awareness, the education that you do, and also what are the other controls that you can leverage. For example, the controls in your payment partner can also act as a deterrent to mitigate that fraud risk.
Excellent, thanks, Simon. So I am going to stick with you on the next question, and you know, you may have actually mentioned some of it in your previous answer, and also Denise, I do want you to be able to chime in on this as well. So, getting into some practical actions, what can businesses do to protect themselves? And
yeah, and again, I'm thinking about from two angles: that business and commercial kind of risk, and then also that kind of real risk around fraud and business email compromise. You know, taking a step back, and particularly in the last kind of 10 years, there's been a huge growth in fintech. You know, there's loads of these new fintech businesses all over the world now. They all say they can send payments in real time. And going back to what Denise said, do your homework, do your due diligence. You know, who is this business? How are they backed? What licenses do they have? Do they really have the right licenses to conduct this activity? How do they safeguard my bank accounts? How do they safeguard the funds that are being held? You know, what types of controls do they employ? So do your due diligence, and that will help you to separate the wood from the trees. And then in turn, that should make your payment experience a lot more smoother and frictionless. And hopefully those good transactions don't get, you know, unnecessarily bothered by those controls. In TransforMate, we're globally regulated. We have licenses all over the world. We've 92 or 93 licenses. We have full ISO certification when it comes to IT security controls, and we safeguard client assets all over the world, regardless of the regulation. So we really apply the highest standards. So again, taking a step back, do your homework before you make a vendor selection. Moving on to the fraud risk. You know, a key point that you mentioned, Andy, was, you know, it comes from every angle. So your response has to come from every angle as well. And the way I would kind of put it is into 3 or 4 different buckets. So awareness is key. You know, all staff at every department, regardless of your business type or size, needs to be aware of the types of fraud. And that should be informed by that risk assessment or that risk discussion that I mentioned earlier. You can have formal training in place where all staff have to undergo some form of training every single year, and then identify those individuals in your business that could be more prone to being the victim of a fraudster in a business setting. So those in the accounts department, those in the procurement department, the managers that are charged with actually incurring these services and then buying these goods, so that they're able to identify those red flags. Like I mentioned, someone wants an early payment, someone wants their beneficiary bank details changed. The next one is about empowering staff. So when someone does think that, hey, this could be a potential fraud here, they should have the power to be able to ask those questions and not fear to ask, to delay a payment, you know, because you want them to make that phone call, you want them to ask for that invoice, you want them to ask for that bank account in order to prove that this is a legitimate request coming from the supplier. So empowerment is important, and people should speak up. And then the third and very last point is your clear policies and procedures. So how do you as an organization actually react when there is a request to change a beneficiary bank, or there's an unusually large transaction request or a payment to a high-risk country, as Denise mentioned? What's your policies and procedures around that? And we see, you know, companies do different things. Like every company is different, therefore their response can be different. But we do see some commonalities, like I mentioned, ringing the supplier back on their landline, you know, not the mobile number on the email that you're talking to, requesting those bank statements to prove the bank details are correct, or if needed, escalate it internally so discussion is higher up.
Great. Denise, would you like to add anything here?
I think just maybe a couple of things. Don't be afraid with regards to your vendor. Don't be afraid to ask for their audit report. You know, if they are big enough and you are bringing them on board to protect you, they are going to probably have to have been audited in terms of making sure that their IT security is fit for purpose, that it's of a certain grade, like Simon mentioned, and you know, you have to make sure that their cybersecurity is top notch, because they can act as a gateway into your organization as a backdoor, which is what fraudsters are always looking for, right? Like, how do we enter? How do we, either through social engineering, through key log stroking, through, you know, malware, and just any kind of penetration that it's just so that they can then take over your business, your computer, and steal all of your money. Because that's what they're there for, right? That's their reason for being. They need to profit. The other thing I would say is maybe look at geolocation as well. Like when you're looking at, you know, where the payments are coming from, when are the payments actually coming from where they're supposed to be coming from? Are payments being made in Kazakhstan when, you know, the originator says that they are making the payment from the US? So there are certain things that you can also do in terms of kind of additional new technology that you can use and new searches that you can use. And again, back to new data points and metadata that you can use to actually help businesses protect themselves. And again, you know, Simon mentioned people. Again, your people are your first line of defense. They are the ones who are going to be, generally it's, you know, technology systems detect a lot, but humans have intuition that you can't at the moment code into robots, and you have to have too much data to train your robots anyways as well, and make it easy for them to report concerns. Have whistleblowing lines available, and in addition to your suspicious activity reporting obligations, you know, make sure that your people feel safe reporting concerns about vendors, concerns about your operations, and things like that as well, because there is a lot of criminal activity taking place. It's the level of fraud is unheard of. I think that, you know, Simon mentioned it's in the billions. In the UK, it's 189 billion cost of business for fraud, which is a very large number. I was going to use a different word. So again, it's all about making sure that you can, again, take little steps, take big steps, and then just do simple things to also protect yourself as well. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So in summary, I mean, and I like the way this has been broken down. I mean, you've said it a bit here, Simon, and also Denise, that, you know, regular audit checks and risk assessments and supplier due diligence, and also, which I think is key that you probably might not necessarily think about, but empowering your staff and your team members to ask those questions. Right, and also having clearly defined policies and procedures, making sure that all of those are mapped out so that each step of the way, everyone knows what's going on. So, okay, well, we're almost at the end of today's session. And it's been an excellent session. Thank you very much, both Denise and also Simon. But I'd just like, before I get onto the TransferMate and Axletree partnership, I'd like to just take a step back to see if there's any final thoughts before we wrap up today's session.
And the fun fact, research has proven that most of these business email compromise that Denise and I have spoken about happen on a Friday evening, later in the afternoon, because that's when, again, the fraudsters see people as most vulnerable. They've had a busy week, they see the weekend ahead, and then that's when that, you know, dodgy supplier invoice or email is received in. So if we're to get really tactical, you know, when you're doing your training, focus on, you know, emails that come in late in the evening or very early in the morning.
Thanks. Denise?
We are in a period of grand scale, massive change, probably the biggest period of change that we've had since the Second World War. And that creates a lot of incentives and opportunities for criminals. So I would say be on guard, but I think also be aware of the fact that criminals prey on social engineering, on making people make mistakes and duping people. So I think also be kind to your employees, especially if it's an inadvertent, you know, it's a mistake. I have clicked on things I should not have clicked on, thinking, oh, there goes my computer, there goes my business, right? And I know better. So I train people on these things. So I think tone from the top, be kind, and be vigilant.
Excellent. So thanks very much, guys. I am going to take just a couple of seconds to just really talk about a little bit about the Axletree and Transformate partnership. So, you know, as you said, Simon, you know, Transformate is globally regulated, and that certainly does bring a wealth of value to our respective client base. So through the Transformate Global Network is going to allow payments to be sent and received in over 200 countries and 140 currencies. And that's something that the Axletree's global client base will be able to benefit from. In addition to that, Transformate global client base will be able to benefit from Axletree's global connectivity and financial messaging platform called Symmetry by Axletree. So we've now come to the end of this session. And for anyone that's interested in learning more about how to significantly reduce risk in cross-border payments and also reduce costs at the same time, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our contact details are here on the screen. So you can contact us either directly or you could go through to our respective websites. I would also encourage you to sign up for the next webinar in the series, which is called Closing the Gap on Cross-Border Payments in the Latin American Market. I would like to thank the audience for attending. I'm hoping it was a good use of your respective times. And I'd also like to thank my panelists. So both Denise and Simon, thank you very much for hosting this session today. And all that's left is for us to say goodbye. Thank you very much, guys.